Hi, this is Dr. Hoefferle again. Today we're going to be talking about the Great Depression and other economic crises. Now, many of you have lived through a massive economic crisis that shook the world in the 21st century. The Great Recession of 2007 to 2009 affected many of you in this classroom. You might have had parents that lost their jobs. You may have lost your job. We had a real economic shift that happened beginning in 2007, picking up in 2008, and really hitting us solidly in 2009. The United States was involved in a global economic recession. Now, recession is a slowdown, an economic slowdown, where you have increased unemployment rates, decreased production rates, and gross domestic product rates. It's not quite a Great Depression, though. A depression is just like a more severe economic crisis. If you lost your job or your parents lost your job, you know that a recession is bad. It's still an economic crisis. And you know that you don't want it to happen again. So what we're going to be studying in this class is we want to understand maybe what are some of the signs that we're on the verge of another global economic crisis. So we want to look for the causes of global economic crisis, because we want to also know how can we prevent it. So if we see some signs, if our government sees some signs, we can know what steps to take to avoid some of the consequences. And then lastly, what are those consequences? So why would we care enough? Are those consequences and the effects of an economic crisis severe enough that it warrants really strong action to stop a Great Depression from happening again? So of course, the best example of an economic crisis that we have in recent world history is the Great Depression. Starting in 1929 and going on through 1939, the whole world was affected by an economic slowdown. And global trade virtually stopped at this point in time. So this Great Depression affected all of the world's population, or I shouldn't exaggerate, most of the world's population in one way or another. Many people lost their lives. Many people faced starvation, homelessness, extreme poverty, and they were desperate for answers. So we're going to be looking mainly at the Great Depression of this period, 1929 to 1939. Now, that wasn't the first time we'd had an economic crisis. I want to remind you that ever since industrial capitalism emerged in the 1800s, it went through boom and bust cycles, where the industrial economies would boom, where you would have really big growth rates and really high employment rates, and people would be making more money and have more money to spend. But then the next year, there could be a stock market crash, millions of people would be unemployed, you'd have a glut in the market, and the prices of things would go down. So we went through cycles of boom and bust ever since the advent of industrial capitalism in the 1800s. It's just that the Great Depression was a bust cycle that lasted for 10 long years, instead of the earlier bust cycles that lasted for 1 or 2 years. All right, so the Great Depression was just more severe, and it lasted longer, affecting more people's lives. What caused the Great Depression then? So we want to look, in order to prevent the Great Depression, we need to look at some of the causes of it. So economists know more about this, and in a global economy class you might learn this, or a business class you might talk more about this. But for us historians, when we look back, we can see that when capitalism, that form of an economy, a free trade economy, is totally unregulated by governments, meaning governments do not make the rules for stock markets, or governments do not make the rules for banks, and governments don't make the rules for corporations. When businesses and industry is free to do whatever they want, they do not regulate themselves. They will try to get as much money as they possibly can for themselves. And they don't think about the bigger picture, the bigger economy of their country or the world, and they don't think long term normally. They think in terms of, especially if they're a stockholding company, they want to see for each quarter an improvement in their stocks. They want to show their investors that they are making money. So it's very short term and very short-sighted by nature, right? So that's one of the causes of economic crises. When you have everybody looking out for themselves and nobody looking and planning for the future, sometimes lots of people can make the same mistake at the same time and cause catastrophe. And that's often what happens in economic crises. Another factor in the Great Depression, more specifically, was that one country was punished for World War I, and that one country was Germany. Now, many people had very little sympathy for Germany anyway. They felt that Germany's imperialism was largely to blame for the war, and Germany had done a lot of damage. And so the people that were victims of Germany in World War I wanted to get some money back to pay for all of their losses, especially Britain and France wanted reparations. They wanted money from the German state. The problem was Germany didn't have any money to make reparations, but they were forced to. Under the Versailles Peace Treaty, they were forced to pay back $33 billion in reparations, which they didn't have. So Germany borrowed that $33 billion from the United States, from our banks, specifically from private banks. And those private banks charged just astronomical interest rates because they know they had Germany over a barrel. See, Germany could barely keep up with its interest rates payments following World War I. All the way through the 1920s, Germany was suffering from skyrocketing inflation, a high unemployment rate. A lot of people were hungry, without work, angry at the state of their country following World War I, looking for someone to blame. So their Great Depression actually started in the 1920s. As long as they could continue to pay back the interest on the loans to American banks, however, the global economic system was still afloat. So as long as American banks did not recall the loans they made to Germany, the global economic system was okay. The problem happened in 1929, though. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed. That means, and we had many stock market crashes before and after that, but what happened in 1929 is you had a number of people who had borrowed money to invest in the stock market, lost that money, and so they could not pay that money back to the United States private banks. So those banks lost their money. And many of those banks, if they lent too much money to people who lost their money in the stock market, they went bankrupt. And there was no protection for people's savings in those banks. So if a bank went bankrupt and you had $10,000 in that bank, you lost all $10,000. So when banks went bankrupt, people lost their life savings. And then those people could not afford to pay back their loans. And so more banks started to suffer. And when banks start to suffer, they try to preserve their lives. They try to bring back all the money that they had lent to other people, including Germany. So big banks, like JP Morgan's bank, recalled the loans it made to Germany. And it said, you need to pay back the principal of the loan in addition to the interest. And Germany couldn't do it. So Germany defaulted on their reparations payments to United States banks. When Germany defaulted, more banks went under, took more people's life savings with them, and fewer businesses could get fewer loans to keep themselves afloat in the United States and all around the world, because American banks were lending money to people all around the world. So you can see the beginnings of a chain reaction. You have a stock market crash, you have banks retracting, calling in their loans, people defaulting on their loans and losing their life savings, businesses not getting the loans they need to keep afloat, then businesses go under and they lay off millions of people, and then those people go to the banks and try to withdraw their life savings, causing more bankruptcies and more banks to go under. And it's a vast global chain reaction. So people all over the world are going to be affected by this. And many people made mistakes all along the line. But the bottom line was everybody was trying to preserve themselves and not thinking about the bigger picture. They were trying to keep the money they had. They were trying to earn more money at the same time. And they weren't seeing the bigger picture of how the global economy was connected. So this chain reaction is what led to the Depression lasting for 10 years. It could have just been one stock market crash, but the stock markets here and around the world crashed repeatedly throughout the 1930s, making things worse and worse. So the immediate effects that we could see from the Great Depression was mainly unemployment. A lot of people lost their jobs as businesses went bankrupt. And so they were desperate and looking for work. There were very few welfare programs, so if you didn't have a job, you had no one to feed you. There were no food stamps yet. There was no unemployment insurance. If you were too old or disabled, you lived in poverty anyway. So poverty dramatically increased all around the world. And as poverty and unemployment increased, more people started to question their governments. They began to question capitalism. They began to question liberal democracy. And they said, if these governments had regulated the economy better, maybe there wouldn't be so many people who lost their lives. Maybe people wouldn't be starving in our rich countries. So people started questioning their governments and starting looking for alternative solutions all around the world. And some of these alternatives are going to be very radical solutions. So they are going to say, well, we've been trying to stay within our government's boundaries, but we're getting poorer and poorer and things are getting worse and worse. We need to change our government completely. So that's the immediate effects of the Great Depression. Now the long-term effects are going to be felt in how different countries responded to the Great Depression and how it's affecting different parts. So now I'm going to go all around the world and give you some case studies of how the Great Depression is going to affect different parts of the world. So one important thing to put in your answer and to remember about the Great Depression and economic crisis is that there were some countries that were not affected by that Great Depression. Russia is one of those. So remember, Russia used to have that big empire. Then they had their revolution in the middle of World War I, where communists overthrew the Russian imperial government, their king. And then they struggled with other Russians and the United States and Britain to try to establish a communist country, which was like a civil war following the Russian Revolution. So they deposed their czar, their Caesar, or their king, Nicholas II, and killed him. And then they fought for who was going to take control of the Russian Empire. So that resulted in several years of a civil war between Bolsheviks, who were basically the communists, the Mensheviks, who are going to be kind of like liberal Democrats. And then the United States and Britain are going to send in their armies because they want to make sure Russia does not become communist, because they think that's going to not be in their economic interests. So there's a lot of people involved in the Russian Civil War, and it really destroys their infrastructure and their economy. So they face a Great Depression of sorts in 1921 to 23. They face a huge famine because of all the fighting and the burning of crops and that sort of thing. So there's a period of adjustment, and millions of Russians die. Up to 10 million Russians died in that famine. It's not part of the global depression, though. This is Russia's own problems caused by their own civil war first. So we're not up to the depression yet. By the time the global depression hits the rest of the world, the communists have won over control of Russia. And they've created out of that Russian Empire a new, what they consider a more democratic kind of a government, which they call the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So they say this is a voluntary union of countries, of nations, under a communist government. Vladimir Lenin, who's pictured there in the lower right, is the architect of this new USSR, a new communist Russia, including other parts of the former Russian Empire. And he's going to try to implement Marxist-Leninist ideology and build it into their kind of a government. So he sees himself, and communists see themselves, as very democratic. So they want workers' control of the government. And so a Soviet is a workers' council. So think of Soviet, the definition of that is a workers' council. It's just a group of workers who get together and they make decisions. So it's kind of workers' decision making, like you would expect from a communist form of a government. When those workers get together, then they vote for representatives to go to a Congress. So they're going to meet kind of like our Congress meets. We elect representatives. The workers are elected representatives in the USSR. And then the Congress would elect a council. So that's going to be kind of like a group, like an oligarchy, a group of people elected by the Congress who are going to make decisions. And then that council will elect a chairman. So you can see it's democratic, it's built into their system, and this is the way that Lenin imagined this would be, that it would be democratic, worker-controlled, it would not be a capitalist form of an economy, it would be a communist form of an economy. And again, a communist economy is simply that the economy runs on behalf of the people for the people's benefit, that everyone owns all property and all money in common, in theory. So theoretically, that's how he created it. Lenin is going to die in the 1920s, however, though. So he's going to die shortly after this new USSR is born, and there's going to be a power struggle over who's going to be the next chairman. And the person who's going to take over Russia is going to be a very bloodthirsty, power-hungry man, pictured here, Uncle Joe Stalin. Joseph Stalin is going to be the chairman of the Communist Party from 1924 to 1953. And he is able to solidify his power by eliminating democracy in Russia. So Lenin had this hope of a democratic communist country, but Stalin was a paranoid, schizophrenic, power-hungry leader. And so he eliminated everybody who wanted it to be a democratic country, and he made himself a dictator of a totalitarian regime. He is going to have all authority in his own person. He's going to be kind of one-man rule. Even though the council and the assembly, the Congress, they're going to meet, he is going to tell them what's going to happen and have total control in his hands alone. So he's going to become a very powerful dictator who lives a long time and has a very powerful impact on the USSR. Now, he also is a communist, but he believes in kind of a communist dictatorship. So he thinks that he can do what's best for all the people of Russia, of the Soviet Union, and he thinks he's smart enough to manage everything, including the economy. So here's why there's no depression in Russia. Joseph Stalin created these 5-year economic plans to improve the overall gross domestic product of the Soviet Union, to improve their economy and improve the lives of all of his people. So he starts off by collectivizing all the farms. He eliminates all private ownership of the farming economy and of agriculture, so that all agricultural production is going to be collectively grown for the use of the collective USSR. So everybody has food to eat, and you're not going to have people starving in the USSR. So that's how they eliminate the starvation part of the Great Depression, is the state owns all the farms, and they're run by the state for the benefit of all the people, in theory. The other thing that he does is he forces industrialization in the Soviet Union, in the USSR. And so he's going to give everybody a job. There's not going to be unemployment in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Everybody has a job. You just don't get to choose what job you get. The state tells you what you're going to do. And so everybody gets a job. Everybody is contributing to making this an economically viable country and improving the lives of everybody. And for a while there in the 1930s, people's well-being in the Soviet Union was improving, so much so that some Americans immigrated to this USSR because they couldn't get a job here, and they heard that the USSR was the land of milk and honey, that you could get a job there, that you'd be fed, you'd have national health insurance for free, that you'd be taken care of from cradle to grave over there. So you see, they fared better in the 1930s than Americans did. Now, they did give up their freedom, though, for this kind of economic prosperity. Joseph Stalin, many psychologists today believe that Joseph Stalin was in fact schizophrenic and paranoid. He was paranoid of somebody assassinating him and overthrowing him. And so he executed anybody at all that he suspected of plotting against him and his country. And he sent out all kinds of secret police and spies to root out people who were griping about his government, were griping about what they had to do for their job. Anybody who complained was a target. 750,000 people died in his purges, his political purges, executing any political opponents. Many more millions were sent off to the gulag, or a work camp, a work prison, to be reformed, to be brainwashed into being a loyal communist citizen. Most of them went to work in the forests of Siberia, the tundra in the forests of Siberia. Siberia had some pretty wealthy mines, gold mines, has oil up there, as well as some timber. And so they worked in this frozen tundra for the state against their will. Now, you can imagine that millions and millions of people were very unhappy with their property being taken away, with being forced to work for the state, all for the same basic living wage. And so the USSR had to have a massive propaganda wing, and it had a whole department just devoted to propaganda, just devoted to selling communism to Soviet citizens as well as to the rest of the world, to portraying Joseph Stalin, as you see in this poster here. It's you see the Russian letters down below there. This is basically showing how Joseph Stalin is like Uncle Joe. He's helping all the children of the Soviet Union, including all the different ethnic groups. Communism promoted racial and ethnic equality. So that's another attractive thing about Soviet communism. They said that all races are equal. All ethnic groups should be equal. So you can see the darker brown Asian kind of children, lighter skinned children there. He is paying for their education. All children will be able to go to school. Boys and girls now go to school. Women and men both get equal job opportunities. Women get to participate in politics. So he's offering equality too. Gender equality, racial equality, economic equality. Of course, that's propaganda. And on paper, that's what he's doing. But in reality, it doesn't work out that way. There still is racism in Russia today. There still is gender discrimination. There still was economic inequality. I mean, Joseph Stalin and his family lived high off the hog. You know, and many of the communist upper echelons lived in palaces and mansions. So if you were high up in the Communist Party, you got perks. It just wasn't the people who own their own businesses that got the perks anymore, because the state owned all the businesses. So that's how they were able to avoid a Great Depression. And again, thousands and thousands of people from all over the world migrated into the Soviet Union to take advantage of this new communist state that seemed to resist any kind of economic crisis. The United States was hit really hard with this economic crisis, with the Great Depression, and our radical response to it was the New Deal. So for many people, they saw this as a very radical response, and Franklin D. Roosevelt as very, very radical. You can see he's pictured there in one of his weekly radio addresses. FDR was a Democrat, and this is the beginning of the big shift of the Democratic Party away from being conservative to being liberal and progressive. FDR was conservative on racial issues, but progressive on economic issues. He was basically what he called himself a pragmatist. What he wanted to do is he wanted to get America out of this economic crisis and prevent another economic crisis from happening. So to get us out of an economic crisis, he believed that the U.S. government should do whatever it took. And if that takes regulating the economy, then that's what we'll do. And so he and his administration, and Republicans actually, many of them got on board with this as well. They were desperate for an answer. They started to pass one law after another. Hundreds of laws were passed in FDR's presidency. So we're looking at the period basically 1932 to, well, he was president until he died in 1945. So 1932 through the rest of the 30s, FDR is trying to get us out of the Great Depression. And so he creates jobs. He creates the Works Progress Administration mentioned in your book, the WPA, which built many of the roads we still use today, many of the bridges, many of the parks that we have today. The Civilian Conservation Corps, which is the CCC, that was created to create jobs for young men who went to camps to build all kinds of infrastructure for the country. So the country benefits, everybody benefits, and the government creates jobs. So it's not a handout, everybody has to work, but it's voluntary. Unlike in the Soviet Union, the US government never forces people to work. It says you can have this job if you want it. So the opportunity to work. Some of the other regulations that the U.S. Government placed on the economy were, we started to regulate the banks. We created the FDIC, and that one is to ensure people's investments in banks. It's still around today, the FDIC. We created the SEC to regulate the stock market, Securities and Exchange Commission. We are going to put in new rules, and we're going to create the Federal Reserve to help have a backup to give money and inject money into our economy if we ever need to save the banks again, which we used in the recession of 2008 to stop us falling into a depression. So all of these are mechanisms to try to stop us from going into another Great Depression, to stop a recession from turning into a depression. And these regulations and checks and balances on our economy, although it's arguable, they have worked in that we have not faced another Great Depression since the 1930s. So they worked in preventing long-term another Great Depression from happening. They did not work in ending the Great Depression initially. So even though they lowered the unemployment rates and they did help alleviate the suffering of people who were poor and starving, overall they didn't end the Great Depression. It wasn't until we had World War II that our government was more willing to dump billions of dollars into our economy, and that ended the Great Depression. We didn't invest really enough money in the economy in the Great Depression to end it. So it was kind of mixed success. It has prevented another depression from happening, but the New Deal did not exactly end the depression. It was just a little too severe and too global for us to end it at that point. Like I said, we had many lasting impacts of this New Deal attempt to end the depression, and the most radical and I think long-lasting of these in many respects was the Social Security Act of 1935. FDR had a brain trust, had a number of intellectuals who he used as advisors to create his economic plans. So he didn't think of all this himself. He relied on experts. And so he gathered together a group of sociologists and economists and businessmen, and he said, what causes poverty in the United States? And one of the things they found, number one, was unemployment causes poverty. So workers do not normally put away enough money to tide them over in case of a Great Depression. If they can't get a job for 10 years, they have nothing to feed their family for those 10 years, and so they lose everything. Most workers might put away enough money to last 3 to 6 months, but after that, they're going to starve to death. So one thing that Social Security Act is going to target are unemployed. And the way that it solves the problem of poverty of unemployed people is all of us now, ever since 1935, a percentage of our income is taken away from us by the U.S. government and put in a safe place so that if we lose our job, it pays that money back to us. It's called unemployment insurance. It's insurance in case you lose your job if you get laid off. Then you can claim that unemployment insurance to tide you over till you can get another job. So that was one way of solving the problem of unemployment and also preventing that kind of poverty in the future. That has worked. We still have unemployment insurance today, and it's still working. You know, I know people that lost their jobs in that Great Recession, and if it wasn't for unemployment insurance, the effects of that unemployment would have been disastrous. Another source of poverty in the Great Depression was for elderly, for people who were too old to work, or they were disabled by some other thing. They were handicapped, and they could not work to support themselves, so they were very poor and they were starving and suffering. So to solve that problem, the Social Security Act says we're going to take away a percentage of your income while you're working and set it aside for when you retire. We call it a pension. So for all of us today, part of our paycheck goes to the federal government, and then when we reach the age of retirement, we're going to get that back, paid back to us, so that we can survive and not starve to death when we're too old to work anymore. So that's another really important part of this Social Security Act of 1935. There were literally hundreds of different provisions of the New Deal. I'm not going to go in depth on them in this class. I just wanted to tell you what's unique about the United States. For many conservatives and Republicans, they thought that this was communist, and they called FDR a communist, right? FDR said, no, I'm a capitalist. I'm saving capitalism. So that's how he saw himself. He said, I'm a pragmatist. I'm doing whatever it takes to save capitalism. For American communists, they said that FDR was a capitalist and he was not doing enough to fix this economy. So for world historians, we would just say FDR is a moderate. Right? Some people would say he's radical, others would say he's conservative. We'll just kind of split the difference and say, no, he's really a moderate, especially when you compare him to the guy pictured in the lower right, Benito Mussolini. Now, he was more of a radical. So in Italy, the Depression hit a bit earlier in the 1920s, kind of like how it hit in Germany in the 1920s. Italy had a hard time recovering from World War I. It did not get any reparations payments out of World War I because it came in really late in World War I. Benito Mussolini, just like Adolf Hitler, was a disgruntled soldier who fought in World War I. And he was a very proud, patriotic Italian. And he felt that Italy had been wronged. He felt that Italy's government was plagued with communists. And he felt that Italy's government was too weak and too inefficient. He felt that Italy needed a better government. He got together with some other soldiers, some other veterans of World War I, and created a new organization called the Fasci di Combattimento. So these are basically the soldier fascists. And at that time in Italy, to be called a fascist was not an insult. To be called a fascist was to be a nationalist, somebody who loved his country. Fasces is the symbol of ancient Rome's glory and power and empire. And so fascists wanted to rebuild the ancient glory and the ancient power and empire of Rome. So fascism today has taken on a different meaning than what it was in Italy back then. Fascism in Italy at that point in time was a movement to make Italy great again, just like it was under the ancient Roman Empire. So it was kind of a form of patriotism, of ultranationalism at that point in time. Ultranationalism is a little bit different from nationalism in that it not only says our country's the best, it also says that all the other countries are inferior to us and they deserve to be taken over by us because they're weak. We are better people, we're a better race of people, and we deserve to conquer the world. So fascism took on this meaning of a militaristic kind of an ideology, a violent, brutal ideology that is willing to dominate and conquer and colonize other groups of people. So it had kind of an imperialist bent to it as well. Now, in order to prevent a depression from happening, like fix the depression in Italy and prevent a new one from happening, the fascist party in Italy tried to redistribute land. It advocated a number of populist movements to grant suffrage to women, to grant more democracy to the people, to demand an 8-hour day and higher wages for workers. So it was trying to get the government to take care of workers more and make things more economically equal, kind of look out for the little guy. But then on the other hand, it was to try to build up the military of Italy and invade and conquer and create more colonies. So that's how you would prevent an economic crisis in the future, is you'd have these colonies filtering in money in the future. So that's how the Depression affected Italy. Benito Mussolini is going to intimidate the King of Italy, and the King of Italy is going to appoint him to be kind of the prime minister. And then from there, Mussolini is going to dismantle democracy in Italy. He is going to kind of create a cult of the dictatorship and make himself seem like this great leader, this guy who's going to organize Italy and get the trains to run on time and really make Italy great again. Now, in Germany, things are going to be a little bit different. In Germany, they had a very liberal democracy, the most liberal in the world, really, following World War I. We call that the Weimar Republic because it was located in the city of Weimar, Germany. And this was a very democratic parliament. They had, the vote was extended to women and all men. This democracy tried to include economic equality and limit the work day to 8 hours a day and increase working class wages. It even allowed freedom of religion. It relaxed rules against homosexuals. It allowed a lot more freedom, individual freedom in German society than they had ever had before. So this republic is going to be very, very democratic and very flexible. And it's going to allow a wide variety of different political parties to function and exist. So a lot of political freedom. The problem is that they were saddled with those reparations payments, and so this government could never raise enough taxes to pay off those reparations payments. It didn't have enough money to rebuild, and so the economy of Germany languished all the way through the 1920s, so that the Germans were sick and tired of the Weimar Republic, of their liberal government not doing enough to get the people out of poverty. One of those impoverished people in the 1920s was Adolf Hitler. He was actually an Austrian by birth, but again, Austrians claimed a Germanic language and a Germanic culture, so Adolf Hitler saw himself as a German, even though he was born in Austria. He fought on the side of Germany in World War I. He was a corporal and he was gassed, and a lot of people make jokes about how that made him demented. We don't know why he had the personality that he did. Psychologists have been arguing over that ever since the World War II, but we do know that that experience in World War I made him very, very angry at how Germany had lost the war. He blamed the Weimar Republic. He blamed the liberals and the Democrats for the downfall of Germany in World War I, and most of all, he blamed Jewish Germans. So he blamed Jewish people in the government, Jewish communists, Jewish bankers, you name it. He blamed all of Germany's problems on Germany. Or on the Jewish people, sorry. He blamed the Jewish people for all of Germany's problems, for Germany's depression. He wrote down his ideas in a very famous book called Mein Kampf. It was written in 1925 when he was in prison. So the Weimar Republic allowed him to go around preaching hate against Jewish people and preaching how the government needed to be overthrown. But when he tried to overthrow the government of Bavaria, a state of Bavaria, he was put in prison for only 9 months. So even for treason and trying to overthrow the government, they were so liberal they let him out. So he was able to take those 9 months to write this book, Mein Kampf, which goes on to be a bestseller. You can actually see it online if you wanted to read more about it. But you've got a little excerpt in Pomerantz, page 307. Go ahead and pause the lecture at this point and turn to page 307 in your Pomerantz book. So the title of his book is My Struggle, Mein Kampf in German, and obviously written by Adolf Hitler. If you turn to page 308, that's when it actually starts, when Adolf's voice comes through. So you can use this to kind of get his thinking and what he's telling the German people about what Germany should do about the Great Depression. So this is a good primary source on Germany's reaction to the Great Depression. So on page 308 in the middle there, he says that the foreign policy of the folkish state must safeguard the existence on the planet of the race embodied in the state. The race is the German race, the Aryan race, by creating a healthy, viable, natural relation between the nation's population, growth on the one hand and the quantity and quality of its soil on the other. So he spends that whole first several pages arguing about how Germany doesn't have enough land. That Germany's acreage, the size of the country, is not nearly big enough for its growing population. So a big part of Mein Kampf is arguing for how Germany needs to have more land, more territory. It needs to expand. So this is good evidence of how his solution to the Great Depression. So he's saying the reason why we're poor is we don't have enough land to grow enough food to feed all of our people. Let's invade and conquer our eastern neighbors. That's what he's saying. Let's invade Russia. Let's invade the east. Let's invade Poland. They got plenty of land. We'll conquer them and take it from them, and then we'll end our Great Depression. So he's talking about that on page 309. Let's see, I'm going down on page 309 and I'm looking over my notes. You should have some of these notes as well. A little bit of example of his racism, his use of scientific racism on page 309, where it says the National Socialist Movement must strive to eliminate the disproportion between our population and our area. And he says, "We as the guardians of the highest humanity on this earth, the German race, are bound by the highest obligation, and the more it strives to bring the German people to racial awareness." So he's trying to get all the German people to be aware of the greatness of their race and what their race is owed. And then he says below, then you get some evidence of his anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish feeling. So this is his evidence of how he's blaming the Depression on Jewish people. So he says today it is the inexorable Jew who struggles for his domination over the nations. No nation can remove the hand from its throat except by the sword. So this is kind of a premonition of the Holocaust, where Adolf Hitler is saying Jews are to blame. Jews are strangling all of our nations in the world. They're dominating us. We need to take up the sword and in bloody revenge cut off the hands of the Jews, cut off the heads of the Jews, get rid of them. They're the problem. They're strangling us. They're the threat to the German race. That's what he's talking about there on the bottom of 309. So more evidence for how he's going to target Russia and Poland. If you look on page 310, in the middle paragraph where it says, "And so we National Socialists, we take up where we broke off 600 years ago. We stop the endless German movement to the south and west and turn our gaze toward the land in the east." So that's Russia. He says, "We speak of soil in Russia and our vassal border states." So if I was Russian and I read this, I would know right away that he's going to invade Russia, which he does. He's going to invade Poland, which he does. He's going to invade Czechoslovakia, which he does. He's telling you up front in 1925, this is his plan for the future for Germany. To get Germany out of its Great Depression, it's going to invade and conquer Russia and draw nourishment for this for the Germanic races. Page 311, he says that Russia used to be ruled by Germanic people, an upper crust of German people that were blonde and blue-eyed, but now it's been taken over by Jewish communists. And these Jewish communists are brutal, blood-stained criminals. They're the scum of humanity. I'm quoting him on page 311. He says that they have bestial cruelty and an inconceivable gift for lying. The international Jew completely dominates Russia today. So he's saying Russia, the Russian Bolsheviks, are all Jewish people. They're part of a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. And so if Germany is going to survive, if their race is going to survive, they must have a preemptive war against Russia. They must have a preemptive war against Jewish people. A great primary source for how Adolf Hitler was thinking in 1925, and then by the time the rest of the Germanic peoples around the world read this in the 1930s, you're going to see how they respond to these ideas about how to get out of a Great Depression. So it's using a very virulent mix of ultranationalism and anti-Semitism to support a solution to the Great Depression, namely expanding into Russian territory and getting rid of Jewish people. He gets a following of people, then they form the National Socialist German Workers' Party. They are not socialist at all, actually. They are a populist group, meaning that they want to try to appeal to the majority of German peoples. And actually not just in Germany, but in everywhere in the world. They are trying to appeal to Germanic peoples. So there was actually an American Nazi party too. There was a Nazi party in England. There was a Nazi party in France, right? So there are Nazi parties. All Germanic peoples are being called upon to unite to support this Nazism. And you can see the swastika there in the middle of the page. That's going to be their symbol for the International Nazi Party. And what they want is more power, more purity for the German race. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party are going to be democratically appointed to power. So they don't have to seize power. Just like in Italy, the king of Germany, the Kaiser, or not the king, sorry. He's not the Kaiser at this point. The president of Germany, who's elected, the president of Germany who was elected, is going to be afraid of the Nazi Party. The Nazis do win a significant number of seats in their House of Parliament in the election of 1930 and 32. They win quite a few seats. The Nazis are having these big rallies and they're whipping up a lot of popular support. And so the president of Germany appoints Adolf Hitler to be the prime minister, to appease those Nazis in his parliament to try to get their cooperation. Once Adolf Hitler is appointed prime minister, though, then he is able to get the parliament to pass a law called the Enabling Act in 1933 to make him the Führer, or the supreme leader, to basically rule on their behalf. So they don't get to vote anymore. So get this, the parliament, or their Congress, their democratically elected group of people, vote to make their prime minister the supreme leader, their dictator. They vote for a dictator. That's what the Enabling Act is. The German Congress is giving away its power to one man because they have so much confidence in that one man and they think he's so popular that the people will follow him and he'll more effectively lead the country than their democratically elected Congress can. It would be like the Senate and the House of Representatives in the United States making President Obama our dictator. They give up their democracy because they have so much confidence in Adolf Hitler. Some of them have so much confidence. Some of them also feel afraid for their lives. They've been threatened by Nazis. Their houses have been burned down. Their families have been threatened. So some of them are terrorized into passing and voting for this act as well. Some of them also are just promised some rewards. That if Adolf Hitler is made the Führer, that he is going to reward them with some high level post in the Nazi party. So it's kind of a combination of reasons why these politicians would give their power to a dictator. So once Adolf Hitler is the Führer, he establishes the Nazi police states. So he creates full employment by employing all Aryan Germans in the government as part of the military. So the military expands tremendously. And he also expands the police forces. So he creates new branches of the police force like the SS. He's going to expand that to millions of people are going to be employed by the government in the military or in the police force. And that's to control the whole German nation a lot more tightly, to totally control the German people. It's going to create kind of an economic miracle. The German government is going to put all these people to work in their government and then also put them to work in mines and in industry. They're going to get their economy going by total government control. Part of that money that they're going to use to pay for this increased police state, because it's going to come from somewhere. Part of that money is going to come from the people that it takes away the rights from. So anybody who opposed the Nazi party, anyone who did not vote for that Enabling Act, are going to lose their property. They'll lose their house, they'll lose their bank account, they'll lose everything they own, and then they're going to be thrown in jail. So part of that money for the economic miracle is going to come from illegally seized property of any opponents of the Nazi police state. So they're going to use terror to terrorize people. They're going to use the laws that they create to take away their property, to fund this economic miracle. And for all the world in the 1930s, by the end of the 1930s, so it takes about 3 or 4 years, so by 37, 38, the rest of the world is looking at Germany with envy and saying, wow, they really turned things around. They're doing better in this depression than the United States is. But a lot of people didn't know where they were getting their money from, that it was seized from all opponents of the Nazi state. All right. So at this point, I want to move on to look at a few other places in the world and how they're affected by the economic crisis. The Latin American countries are going to be affected because they had mainly export-based economies, where they were exporting raw materials to the rest of the world. In the Great Depression, a lot of countries put up protectionist laws so that they charged higher taxes on any imports coming in, and so they favored their own country's products. And so that protectionism really hurt Latin American export-based economies. So they were going through quite a lot of economic turmoil as well. And one way that politicians in Latin American countries dealt with that economic turmoil is they turned to corporatism. And that's to kind of forming an alliance with, not corporations, don't think of corporations, think of like groups, like trade unions. So you'd get people like Getulio Vargas, who is going to be a very wealthy man who makes an alliance with trade unions, labor unions, with other workers groups, with the working class essentially. And so they vote for him and give him all the power, and in exchange he passes laws like the 8-hour work day and increased minimum wage laws and that kind of thing. So in Latin America, we call a dictator a caudillo. So a caudillo is basically a strong man or a dictator, usually a wealthy man of Spanish heritage. So you can see this man is a white man. Many of Latin Americans, of course, are Native Americans still. But he kind of buys off their allegiance by passing laws that favor the poor and the working classes. So Brazil's Getulio Vargas, pictured in the upper right, is one example of a strong man. Perón is going to be another example of a strong man, but Latin America has this tradition of political leaders getting popularity by doing things for the working class and for the people, by passing laws and for their favor. In the colonies, in Africa and India, the European colonies, Europeans are going through this economic crisis. And so the colonies are looking to Europe and saying, wow, your economy really isn't very good. You don't have a superior civilization because your people are starving too. So in Africa, this kind of spurs more resistance against colonialism. In India, it's going to feed more Indian resistance to British domination, and more Indians are going to say, well, the British aren't all that great. They're suffering from high unemployment and high poverty rates too. Your book talks a lot about Mohandas or Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma means great soul. He's probably the most famous of all Indian leaders, and he is going to be the leader of this new resistance movement starting in the Great Depression, and it's going to culminate after World War II. I'm going to talk more about Mohandas Gandhi and his Hind Swaraj document. We're going to come back to that later on once we get through with World War II. So just make a little note. We'll come back to talking about India and how it gets its independence later on. But for the Great Depression, I want you to know that it does help spur India's movement for independence. Well, one more thing I want to say about Mohandas Gandhi here, because it's part of the Great Depression. So one of the things Mohandas Gandhi was saying was that we needed self-rule, and that means that Indians needed to develop their own form of an economy that was more based in the humane religious beliefs of India, so in Hinduism. And part of Hinduism is that everybody has a job to do and everybody should do that job. And so Gandhi's background was that they were weavers, and so he would weave his own clothes and he would wear his own rough woven fabric that he made himself. And so you could see he was very, very modest in how he dressed. He dressed like a poor Indian, and he identified with the impoverished Indians. And he said to the Indians, we need to take control of our economy ourselves. Don't buy anything more from the British. Don't benefit their economy. Develop our own Indian economy instead and get us out of the Depression that way. I want to end up by talking about how the Great Depression affected modern Turkey. So many of you know Turkey today as kind of on the front lines in the war with Syria, with that civil war raging in Syria. You can see it shares a border with Syria. Turkey was part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire was dismantled after World War I with the Versailles Peace Treaty. Its colonies were taken away from it. So Egypt was once a colony, and that was taken away by the British. Tunisia was taken away by the French. Iraq was taken away by the British. British took over Palestine, took it away from the Ottomans. Greece was able to take over part of its territories in the Balkan Peninsula. And then the Greeks sent in its military to occupy Turkey following World War I. See, there was no Turkey prior to World War I. With the Versailles Peace Treaty, they were an occupied, conquered country following World War I. They were occupied by Greek military forces, their enemies. And so, of course, the Turkish did not want to put up with that, so they waged war against the Greeks. And finally, in 1923, the Turkish Turks won, and in the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, the new Republic of Turkey was born. So Turkey was only founded in 1923. So it's founded as a republic, as a democratic liberal republic, Unlike all the other former colonies of the Ottoman Empire, see, they are not going to be, not going to have the same history as Turkey. So they're going to have very different kinds of governments as a result. Turkey's unique nature is really due to one man, a military man named Mustafa Kemal, who was later dubbed the father of the Turks, or Ataturk. Ataturk just means father of the Turks. And Mustafa Kemal led that war for freedom for the Turks and the freedom to create their own country. So he really created this new liberal democracy in Turkey. He intentionally wanted it to be more like the European countries than like the rest of the Ottoman Empire, than like the Middle East. So he realigned Turkey with Europe. And he did this by passing a number of laws extending European culture, politics, law, the European calendar, European education through Turkey. So in terms of the culture, they're going to get rid of the Sharia. They're not going to be a Muslim culture anymore. Women are not going to have to wear veils. They are going to dress more like Europeans. They are going to have a European kind of a parliament. They're going to have a democracy. Women are going to be given the right to vote. They're going to adopt the European Latin alphabet. They're going to have a European calendar instead of a Muslim calendar. They're going to use European science in their schools. So Turkey is going to become a lot more like Europe than like the rest of the Middle East because of Ataturk. He's going from the Soviet Union, he's going to borrow the 5-year economic plan that they had, and he's going to get Turkey to industrialize, and he's going to get Turkey to become more wealthy and to dig itself out of that global economic depression. And it does so fairly well. Turkey today is one of the wealthiest countries in all of the Middle East. So even though technically it's part of the Middle East, Turkey is a lot more like Europe than the rest of the Middle East is. It's still a Muslim majority, but it does not have Sharia, and its culture is a lot more like Europe and the United States, all because of Mustafa Kemal and his ideas for how to get out of their Great Depression. All right, that's it for today. When we come back for the next installment, we're going to be talking about the Holocaust some more, and we're going to talk about World War II. Thanks for listening, and I will come back here later for one more of these videoed lectures.